A brittle blood-smeared leaf tore free and flopped onto the table as the archivist extracted it. Suspicion drove the archivist's hands. He flattened the page with the heel of his palm and read the column of names, each followed by a small circled date. The first name was crossed out, the ink smeared, but the next three were neat and deliberate. That discovery announced the chapter's problem. The ledger did not record births or rents, it scheduled deaths. He did not pause to look up. The archivist smelled old wax and iron and lifted the page toward the lamplight, counting aloud in the cramped room. Joran, listen. This date, he tapped a circled number, it is in 9 days. His voice was low. He folded the page carefully and slid it into his jacket. Within 2 minutes the archivist had established who he was and why he moved like this. He was a cataloger of forbidden things, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a pocket watch that was more habit than timepiece. He had spent months in vaults and ruined sacristies, matching ink to hand and hand to faction. Tonight he had returned with a ledger leaf that exposed a decision made by other hands, a timetable for communal death. He did not tell anyone how badly the page made his fingers tremble. He kept the trimmer in the way he closed the desk. He left the dim archive chamber with the leaf folded inside a leather journal. Outside the corridor smelled of damp stone. He found Scribe Lina at her bench counting thread and paper. Lina looked up as he entered and said, "You took too long, archivist." Lina's tone was sharp. She always kept business clipped. "Lina, the archivist, look at this." He put the leaf on the table between them. She drew closer, eyes narrowing. "The names are scheduled. Look at the circles." Lina's fingers hovered above the paper. She did not touch. Lina, read one name aloud, voice flat. "Marek Kellen, 21st. That is in 8 days." She the date like a weight dropped. Lina had been a scribe for the archivist for 3 years. She had a habit of counting letters before questions. Her hands betrayed nothing until a thin sound escaped her throat. "Tell me what you saw." The archivist. He did not raise his voice. He waited for Lina's eyes to lock with his. Her hand found the brass magnifying lens attached to the ribbon and pulled it closer. They went next to the tavern where Joran sheltered in the corner of a back room. The archivist pushed the latch open and found Joran cowering over a cup. Joran's skin had lost its color, his mouth trembled. "Joran, the archivist who wrote the dates." Joran blinked and looked up, pupils wide. "It was the keeper, sir." "The high keeper," he said. "The calendar was the will of order. I saw the lists. People were assigned a day." Joran's voice came out thin. He swallowed. "The archivist, assigned by who?" "The high keeper." Joran's fingers dropped into his lap. He circled them himself sometimes. When he did not, the stewards did. They ensured the dates matched the cycles. He the last word like a prayer he could no longer place. Suspicion shifted to alarm. The archivist's jaw tightened. He had suspected control. He had not yet imagined orchestration. He left the tavern and took the ledger to the makeshift study where Mara, the young cartographer, unrolled star charts on the floor. Mara smelled of ink and clay. She knelt with a ruler and matched lines until the geometry made sense. "Mara, the archivist, match this sigil to the chart." He handed her the leaf. She traced the symbol with the tip of a pencil and then pressed both palms to her knees. "Mara, the sigil marks a conjunction. It repeats every 36 days. If they use the conjunction, the next marked cluster falls in 3 weeks. She did not speak the word fate. She described cycles as cartographers describe coastlines. The mapping made the threat concrete. The next scheduled cluster would be a set of coordinated dates across several villages. An external event broke the quiet. A knock came at the study door. The archivist opened to find a courier handing a folded scrap, its edges singed and a single name visible. The courier muttered about fires in a distant hamlet. That was the first external confirmation that the ledger's dates were already affecting towns. The archivist folded the scrap into the journal. At dusk they reconstructed a ceremony from testimony and fragmentary liturgy. The account placed the high keeper at the center of a ruined chamber, counting on his fingers as he spoke. He instructed acolytes in a ritual that made selection theatrical and absolute. The archivist voiced the reconstruction aloud while Mara and Lina set tokens on the work table to mark steps and positions. In the reconstructed scene, the high keeper's voice was commanding. Mara refused, Lina reading the reconstruction from a torn account. The archivist repeated. Mara resisted. The name hit both like a small, bright pain. They staged the act with models. The keeper at the carved stone calendar disc, acolytes arsing in a circle, a slab stained with old iron. They argued over motive. The archivist insisted the rite was theological misreading. Lina insisted the rite was spectacle meant to normalize killing. Their voices rose in the cramped study. Lina, the archivist, you claim spectacle. Show me the link. He leaned forward. Show me the spectacle. Lina fired back. High Keeper made it a public law. He used sermons. He had the ring and the stole. He made choices visible. Her hands moved fast. They reached a rapid exchange. Archivist, Lina answered. Mara objected. Lina cut back, each line short, abrasive. The back and forth clarified that the High Keeper used ritual to justify administrative action. The argument ended when Mara slammed her palm on a chart and said, if the charts align, they can order famine or a poisoned supply chain to make the date true. That statement changed the tone from superstition to deliberate design. That change created a new plan. The archivist moved them into the ruined cemetery at dawn to confront Joran again. He wanted confession tied to action. Joran arrived pale and shuffling. They stood among toppled stones and a broken statue. Joran, the archivist, tell us exactly how the supplies were managed. Were you part of it? Joran's hands trembled. We rotted grain sacks. We stopped the wells. I filled barrels with bitter roots. I thought it would spare others. I was wrong. He broke his gaze on the ground. You did it, Lina. Her voice was small. Joran nodded. I did it for the dates. The High Keeper those days would restore order. The confession made the plan concrete. Murder by policy was a new kind of horror. The archivist's response was not a speech. He gripped the edge of a toppled stone hard enough for his knuckles to whiten. An unexpected event occurred. Someone stomped through the gravel and called the archivist's name. A child from a nearby ruin ran up with a scrap of cloth the color of a ceremonial stole. The child said, the altar was smashed last night. That report led them to the ruined altar chamber, arriving at dawn. They found the carved calendar disc on a table, hairline fractures spidering across its surface. A section had been pried free. The archivist saw fresh scratch marks and a smear where the piece had been handled. He looked at Lina and found her fingers stained. She had removed a fragment. Lina, the archivist quietly, what did you take? She thumbed the faded ribbon at her throat and looked away, a fragment to study. I thought I could protect it. Her voice had a cracked edge. The archivist steadied himself and asked, why did you not tell me? She answered, because I feared you would lock it away. I feared the sect would return and find it whole. Lina's reply sounded like apology and calculation at once. The archivist's suspicion turned inward. He felt betrayed by someone who had worked by his side. They did not explode. Instead, they pressed questions. Lina explained that some within their group argued the fragment could be used to decode the calendar faster. Mara, we needed every piece. We planned to rejoin them, not for worship, but to stop them from using it wrong. The exchange revealed conflicting priorities and fractured trust. At midnight, the archive drill that had been gnawing at the edges of the chapter reached its peak. The archivist burst into a clandestine rite. Torches used by the remnant threw hard light against the carved disc. The High Keeper stood at the center, ring catching the flame, his voice low and steady. He raised a ceremonial dagger and began to chant a list of dates. The archivist walked in, steps loud on stone. Stop, he ordered. The High Keeper looked at him without surprise. Archivist, the High Keeper, you interfere because you fear what you cannot control. His voice had the slow cadence that guided rituals. Lina stood to the archivist's left, face pale. Some remnant members tensed around the keeper. High Keeper, the archivist, you are not gods. You are men who set calendars and then create outcomes. He moved to the disc and found the missing edge. He grabbed it. A rapid exchange followed, voices clipped and sharp. Let him speak. The High Keeper, no. Lina moved. Acolytes shifted. The fight had 3 short, explosive counters. The keeper ordered. The archivist lunged. A remnant stepped between. Lina pushed forward and a jar shattered on stone. 3 concrete actions changed the room. A thrown cloak revealed the keeper's ring. Mara shoved the calendar disc to the floor, and Joran, who had followed, grabbed a torch and set a tapestry alight. The scene became a cascade of choices rather than a single speech. Flames licked the carved edges. It ended in a decision point. The archivist could destroy the disc and remove the record of scheduling forever. He could preserve the relic and keep the testimony of what happened. He hesitated long enough for fire to heat the air and for the High Keeper to smile once, faintly. The archivist chose to pry the smashed disc free and carry it out in pieces. Lina, Mara, and 2 other hesitant remnant members followed. The High Keeper did not physically stop them. He watched as if cataloging a lesson. Joran dropped to his knees in the ashes, chest heaving. That moment contained multiple emotion shifts. Suspicion hardened to anger, anger folded into panic, panic gave way to a steely resolve to preserve evidence. Each change showed in limbs and tone, hands clenching, voices shortening, a sudden, hard quiet when the disc clattered. No abstract words described the feelings. Only actions and short dialogue lines did. At dawn the group gathered in the archivist's study. They catalogued fragments on a table under cold light. The archivist aligned shards by the carved sigils, photographing edges and tracing tool marks with his magnifying lens. He labeled each shard and wrote notes in his ledger in a script that would survive fire. Lina worked with a steady hand. "We cannot bury this," she said. "If we bury it, they return with other pieces." Her voice was plain. Mara looked at the catalogue and added, "We must map dates to supply lines and sermons. If we can connect the circles to actions, we can show they engineered outcomes." Her suggestion moved them from feeling to plan. Joran sat apart. He folded his hands and said, "I made it happen." He kept repeating it to himself like a rote confession. The archivist did not comfort him. He instead pressed for details. "Which villages? Which merchants?" he asked. Joran answered in clumsy bursts of detail. He named 2 stewards and a merchant who had cooperated. That naming was a pivot. It provided targets for inquiry and safety. An external event punctured the work. A courier returned with a note warning that a small chapel had been set aflame where an unmarked date had been scheduled. That confirmed their fear that fragments in the wrong hands could still trigger violence. They catalogued until the sun climbed and shadows shortened. The archivist photographed a shard and found a fresh marginal mark on a torn margin he had thought empty. The mark was in a hand different from the keeper's, a slender, impatient stroke in dark ink. He leaned in until the magnifier made the pen work giant and precise. "Lina," he said, looking up, "this mark is new. It points to another date." He did not say the date aloud at first. He wrote the numbers on a slip and placed it beside the shard. The room gathered around the paper. Lina read the numbers and did not breathe for a count. 27 days, she said. Her voice had no flourish. Mara added, "They intend a sequence, not a single event." Their realization was not poetic. It was a technical one about calendars and logistics. The chapter closed on a small, sharp, final beat. The archivist slid the photographed shard into a protective wrap and set it on the ledger. He then looked up and made a clear, procedural decision. He would send a copy of the catalogue to 2 magistrates and 1 archivist in a neighboring hold. He prepared the dispatch and sealed it. The final image in the room was concrete. His hand closing the dispatch, the wax pressing the paper flat, the sound small and exact. He did not say words about fate or destiny. He did not promise revenge or prophecy. He acted. He packed the ledger, the fragments, and the thin slip that bore the new marginal mark. Lina took the sealed dispatch. Mara took the photographed charts. Joran, still shaking, followed to the door. The last line of the chapter ended not with a reflection but with action. The archivist turned the table lamp low and, while arranging shards, discovered 1 more marginal scratch he had missed earlier. He let his finger trace it and found that someone had added a small circle around a blank space. He slid the slip with the 27-day note beside it and felt the simple, physical weight of decision. A new date had been written into the ledger, and the clock had already started. He closed the journal and wrapped it tight, then walked into the corridor to prepare the dispatch to magistrates who might act. His steps were measured. The day had begun. They levered the stone disc out and the disc fell with a dry, hollow thunk that shook dust into Mara's hair. Suspicion tightened the archivist's jaw. He pressed his palm to the carved face and rid the concentric rings by torchlight. The disc smelled of damp mortar and old smoke. This was not a memorial, he thought. It was a schedule. He had already known there would be danger. The brittle blood-smeared leaf from the previous haul had landed on his table and bled through to the linen beneath. He had flattened that page with the heel of his hand and looked at a column of names, each followed by a circled date. The leaflet had not been a warning. It had been a pattern. Suspicion pushed him to pry deeper, and that same suspicion drove him now as he crouched above the disc. Mara shifted the crowbar and wiped grit from her knuckles. The outer ring is names. Mara, the next ring, dates. Her voice was low and even. The archivist repeated the words aloud, measuring the sound, names and dates. He counted the notches with his fingertip. They worked in 2-hour shifts at nights, the archivist and Mara, because daylight drew inquiries and daylight closed doors. He kept the brass magnifying lens on a ribbon around his neck and drew it across an inscription, while Mara scrubbed at a flaking sigil. Their hands moved like men cataloging evidence, each motion an attempt to convert fear into an answer. Determination replaced the initial prick of suspicion. He would map the disc, match it to the leaf, and explain how a calendar could order deaths. They carried the disc back to the cloister's makeshift scriptorium and set it on the table. Candle wax pooled around its edge, and the flame threw a reflected ring across the stone. Brother Elias, when he arrived, walked with a cane and a gait that rattled like old hinges. "You have it, Elias, you found the center." His eyes flicked to the date marks. Brother Elias had the brittle tone of someone who had survived too many winters. He tapped a knuckle against his lip and named villages from memory. "They marked me once, Elias, they marked my village the same way." He listed a date and a ritual cadence. The archivist listened and wrote each word. When Elias lifted his sleeve, the archivist saw faded inked numbers beneath scabbed skin. Elias's voice went thin and he added, "The High Keeper signed off on those dates." Dialogue filled the room then. High Keeper. The archivist, High Keeper, Elias repeated. He counted cycles. He set the calendar. Mara folded her arms and said, "If the High Keeper signed it, they kept records beyond memory." Her syllables were precise. The archivist checked his notes and said, "We cross-reference the leaf and the disc. If they match, we have operation, not liturgy." Outside, rain gathered in gutters and drummed on the cloister's roof. The archivist spread fragments under the magnifier and began to trace repeating symbols. He moved from symbol to symbol and the pattern settled into place. Entire village rosters aligned to single-circled dates. He read names and matched them with the roster rolls they had seized earlier. Each match was a small strike against the idea that the calendar was benign. Mara found marginalia in a brittle page sewn into a surviving liturgy. She traced a set of tiny digits tucked between lines. "Look here," she said. "These aren't prayers. These are instructions." Her fingers smelled of ink and dust. She held the page to the light and found measurements and shorthand for poisons, timing, and detachment orders. The archivist felt the air draw in around his chest. The evidence shifted from theology to logistics. They prepared supply lists, Mara tapping the tiny script. They scheduled carriage times, batches of ash, portions of emetic. "This is how they made the dates happen." Her voice hardened on the last word. The archivist underlined a line and wrote operation. Scheduled mass removal. A new feeling uncoiled in him, not just determination, but a cold, practical fear that the calendar was a functioning machine. Brother Elias stayed awake through that night and into pre-dawn, recounting details from forced marches and requisition lists. They moved detachments at dawn, Elias. They used smoke signals and bell codes. They had a ledger of who would go and who would stay. He paused and rubbed the crease between his brows. They wore the High Keeper's stole. They answered to his ring, the archivist questions in short, deliberate bursts. "Who carried the ledger?" he asked. "Who marked the disc?" Elias named 2 acolytes and described a room where the High Keeper counted by candlelight. The archivist made a note of the acolytes' ring patterns and the exact phrase Elias used for the ringing code. Each new fact pushed the danger from theoretical toward immediate. They photographed the disc quadrant by quadrant under a cold lamp. The archivist felt each shutter click like a pulse. When he enlarged the images on a crude viewer, a smudged column emerged where a village roster overlapped his own handwriting. The archivist froze. A name from his childhood, a hamlet he had left at 15, sat circled and annotated. He set the lens down with a small, controlled motion. Mara saw his hand tremble. "What is it?" she asked. He lifted the photograph and said, "My village." They listed the families. They listed my father's name. The word father made his voice compress. Mara read the line and her face went tight. Elias, who had been dozing, sat up and hissed. "That marking is recent. Panic arrived, but the archivist kept his hands steady. He closed his jaw and said, "We stop the next date on that column. We stop it today." Determination hardened into action. He fetched the smudged, magnified print and circled the date he could barely read. The room narrowed to a single task: prevent the dispatch on that scheduled day. They drafted a plan in 3 parts. Mara would search the cloister's supply ledgers for the poison shorthand. The archivist would consult regional carriage logs and contact sympathetic ferrymen. Elias would try to reach a former acolyte who might respond to an old oath. They spoke fast and used names often. Mara the archivist, find the shorthand. Elias. Mara added, press him tonight. Elias answered, I will try. The dialogue was a machine of decisions. By mid-morning, a group of cloaked acolytes arrived at the archive threshold. Their hoods hid faces but not posture. One pushed forward and said, the High Keeper demands custody of the disc. His voice was pitched to the corridor. The archivist stepped into the light and countered, the disc is evidence. It stays with the archive. Mara closed the scriptorium door and set her shoulder against it. There followed a quick, sharp exchange. Archivist. The lead acolyte said, you do not have jurisdiction, archivist. The archivist replied, I do have custody. The cloister's rule is clear. The lead acolyte laughed without humor. The High Keeper's law overrides your cloister's rule. Brother Elias, the archivist called. Brother Elias answered, hoarse. The argument tightened and pushed toward violence. There were 3 rapid lines of back and forth as the acolytes pushed their claim. Mara stepped forward and said, then sign a warrant. The acolyte spat. The warrant is in the High Keeper's hand. Elias clattered his cane forward and said, you will speak with me before you take what you do not own. The exchange ended with no resolution. The acolytes withdrew with thin threats and promises that they would return. The return of the acolytes tightened the pressure. The archivist and Mara accelerated their cataloging and cross-referencing. They found instructions for timed smoke, for bell codes, for ration distribution that matched the dates on the disc. Each matched instruction made the calendar less spiritual metaphor and more a coordination sheet for mass removal. Mara's hands moved faster. The archivist chewed the inside of his cheek and checked the circled date again. On the photography desk, while the archivist examined a damaged quadrant, he found smudged ink where his own village name overlapped. He read the annotation aloud. They assign an escort of 8, he said. They list departure at first light. The room went very quiet. Mara and Elias leaned in. Elias, that escort number was the High Keeper's standard. The archivist felt the ground tilt under his feet. The mid-chapter cliffhanger came suddenly. The archivist's inked finger hovered over the date, and the candle guttered. Through the open window someone knocked in a slow, deliberate pattern on the outer gate. Mara whispered, do you hear that? The archivist answered, they are testing us. He snatched the photograph and shoved it into his coat. They all moved toward the inner door with shoes whispering on stone. They waited 2 hours with the disc between them and plans sketched on scrap parchment. Then, in the afternoon, the acolytes forced entry into the ritual chamber. The archivist had gone to the disc to deface the marked date in a small, desperate act to erase the number so the escort could be denied a written order. The acolytes slammed into the chamber like a closing hand. What followed was physical and immediate. Mara shoved a candle and a bowl. The flame toppled and hissed as it met spilled oil. An acolyte reached for the disc and the archivist lunged. Hands grabbed the stone. There was scraping, slaps, and a cracked cry, Mara. The archivist shouted, stop. Mara struck a gloved hand and the sound of ceramic against bone came quick and sharp. The altar tiles took the weight of bodies as they shoved. Dialogue fractured into short lines as the struggle unfolded. Leave it! The archivist snapped, we cannot let them take it. You will obey the High Keeper. An acolyte barked, you will not. Mara cut him off with a grunt as she twisted his wrist. Elias tried to intervene but his cane toppled and he called, archivist, the flank. The exchange was 6 blows of words and limbs. The archivist made a decision that would scar the stone and alter lives. He reached to the metal scraper and dragged it across the carved date. The tool caught, through sparks, and gouged a crescent out of the inscription. An acolyte crashed forward and the archivist met him with his shoulder and the scrape of leather. The disc split in one sector and a thin line of dust lifted. They pulled back as chants rose in the corridor. The acolytes retreated with curses and promises. The stone lay scored. The circle date was partially destroyed, but not erased. The archivist's hands were raw. Mara's sleeve bore a tear and Elia's breath came in short, rattling pulls. The chamber smelled of burned oil and blood from a split knuckle. Afterwards, they counted losses and noted damage. 2 candles had burned down to stubs and several parchments were singed. The archivist ran his fingertip along a new crack and found a hidden groove beneath the inscription. He traced it and revealed a series of tally marks. They encoded layers. Mara, this is not one calendar. It's nested timetables, Elias added. This is how they protected their orders. The archivist recorded each tally and mapped the hidden groove against the leaf from the previous hall. The unexpected reveal changed their plan. The hidden tally showed that the dates were not arbitrary. Some were decoys while others were active. The archivist realized the partially destroyed date might still be legible in the field if the acolytes consulted their own shorthand. He weighed the risk, then removed a shard of stone and hid it in his coat. They withdrew from the ruined chamber and sealed the door. Mara carried the disc's photographs and Elias held a list of names. The archivist felt a new sequence of emotions move through him. Suspicion to determination, determination to fear, fear to stubborn resolve. Each shift altered the orders he gave. He Mara to secure the conservatory supplies and instructed Elias on who to contact. Their voices were clipped and direct. Outside the corridor, the cloister's gate sounded as if someone paced with a deliberate cadence. They did not sleep that night. They sent runners to ferrymen and left coded notes with trusted contacts. The archivist catalogued the damaged sectors and wrote a precise plan for bluffing custody of the shard. He made choices that depended on other people. Elias agreeing to speak to an old contact, Mara to fabricate a ledger entry that might mislead patrols, and a ferryman to stall a scheduled escort. The next morning the cloister bell rang for curfew, and the archivist watched the doorway for faces. He checked the list again and said, "We bought a week, maybe less." Mara folded the photograph and set it in a box. Elias gripped his cane and said, "You did more than buy time. You broke their instrument." The archivist did not answer at once. He smelled smoke on his fingers from the scrape and a metallic taste in his mouth. They had shifted the balance but not resolved the larger threat. Word of the scuffle spread quietly. An acolyte's friend pressed in the market and the archivist received a folded note with a single line. "The High Keeper does not forgive." The archivist read it and passed it to Elias. "High Keeper, Elias, looking toward the cloister's private stair. He will not stop with threats." The archivist buttoned his coat and slid the shard deeper into his pocket. At dusk, as they assessed wounded parchment and reorganized supplies, the archivist found one more marginal note in Mara's pile. It named a courier route and a safe house used by the High Keeper's men. Mara pointed to a line and said, "If we intercept here, we might catch their ledger and expose the mechanism entirely." The archivist looked up and nodded. "Then we intercept," he said. They organized the intercept for the coming night. Elias would act as bait, Mara would shadow the courier from a distance, and the archivist would take the shard and approach the rendezvous disguised as a clerk. Each role required precise timing and trust. The archivist felt the final emotion in the chapter fold into place, a tense, quiet resolve that did not need words. They left the archive with a list of names, the shard hidden, and the damaged disc sealed behind the scriptorium door. The archivist locked the box and slid the key into a pocket stitched under his vest. His hands were steady when he touched the brass. He walked out with Mara and Elias at his flanks and heard the gate close behind them, heavy and definite. The chamber remained inside, its carved rings and scored dates now a concrete problem that demanded action. They closed the door and took one last, careful look at each other's faces. Mara checked the magnifier strap. Elias straightened his cane. The archivist breathed once and said, "We move tonight." Mara replied, "We stop them or we die trying." Elias managed a dry smile and said, "Then we shall try." The chapter ended on a concrete movement. They stepped into the corridor and vanished toward the rendezvous point. A hooded acolyte pressed a charcoal, stained stylus to the calendar disc as the archivist's hand came down on the other's wrist. Suspicion pulled at him with the same weight it had since the brittle blood smeared leaf first landed on his table. He had not come to the hilltop merely to observe. Mara shoved him backward. Stone bit into his knee. An urgent line of chanting closed around them as torches angled like teeth. The calendar's fresh notation glinted under moonlight. A circled date with a small annotation in a margin the archivist recognized from the leaf. The immediate problem was clear. The sect intended to enact that date tonight. He moved before his mind finished naming the danger. He kept his voice low. Elias, stop. The archivist, and the acolyte's hand jerking up answered him with noise. The man who held the stylus was young enough to shake. The archivist's suspicion hardened into a plan. He could not leave the disc to be marked. He reached for the stylus with his left hand and tried to wrench it free. They had not yet introduced themselves when the first shove landed. Acolytes pressed outward, forming a rough ring. Mara hissed and tore a scrap of cloth from her sleeve. The archivist could taste iron and baked earth on the wind. He felt the calendar's carved grooves under his fingertips through the dust, remembering how they levered the stone disc out earlier, how the priestly hands had cursed the motion, and the hollow thunk it made as it came loose. That memory sharpened his movements now. The disc was a machine of ritual weight, not a passive relic. Acolyte voices rose in a cadence that matched the carved cycles. An enforcer stepped forward. What do you think you are doing? He demanded. The archivist felt fear, a quick, focused flinch, and then a cold steadiness. Fear made him faster. He looked to Elias and to Mara. Elias, he said, this margin, the names, where did you learn to mark them? The acolyte's jaw worked. Elias swallowed. He kept his eyes away from the High Keeper's projection of authority on the hillside. We follow the hand, Master, Elias, the pattern tells us. The Keeper taught us how to read the rings. His voice broke on the last word, not from fatigue, but from being pressed between duty and what he had seen earlier. The archivist reached for the disc with both hands now, not to steal but to inspect. He traced one furrowed ring until his fingertip found the hidden notch they had noted by torchlight before. This was the physical hinge of the calendar's mechanism, the place where dates could be made to appear and disappear. Mara crouched and tested the stone circumference with the heel of her palm, feeling the metal within. The discovery changed the stakes. If the disc contained a contrivance, then the dates might be manufactured, not ordained. A push from behind sent the archivist forward into Elias, and a ringing clang echoed as a torch met carved stone. Step back, ordered a voice from the procession. The archivist's suspicion shifted into doubt. If the mechanism could manufacture dates, who had been setting them? The High Keeper's face rose from the crowd in his memory. The ink, stained fingers, the ceremonial stole, the way he counted cycles on his fingers. Doubt bent the archivist's mouth. He had once thought ritual had been the instrument of belief, not the instrument of murder. Mara's fingers found a scrape on the disc's rim where red staining had dried. She caught the archivist's eye and mouthed a word he had learned to trust. Take. He felt a sudden surge of resolve. He bent, broke a thin shard of the disc where the margin had been marked, and pushed it into his coat before anyone could close on him. The acolyte Elias stumbled then, eyes flashing with panic and something else. A small, terrified relief. He lurched toward the archivist and whispered, "There is a tablet. I kept it. It shows numbers that were not in the elder's hand." Elias's confession landed between them like a stone. That confession turned the immediate problem into an accusation that could split the order. Mara's breathing tightened. She scrubbed at her sleeve to hide fresh stains. "We leave now," she said, and she was already moving, drawing the archivist's sleeve. The procession tightened and candles flared. The archivist felt 3 quick emotion shifts within the space of a single exchange. Suspicion to doubt, doubt into fear, and fear into rapid resolve. He accepted the shift. He moved with Mara and Elias while chanting swelled into a press of bodies behind them. They did not escape cleanly. An acolyte grabbed Mara's shoulder. The archivist turned and slammed an elbow into the man's sternum. The man fell back, cursing. A blow struck the archivist's temple. His vision nicked the edge of black. He steadied, tasting copper. He kept fingers cradling the fragment in his coat. The nearby torches cast faces into high contrast, pinching the crowd into sharp, accusatory shapes. The archivist refused to look at the High Keeper on the dais. He feared the man's eyes would narrow into conviction that justified violence. They ducked under a leaning arch and ran across hard, packed turf toward a service corridor. The chanting thinned then thickened like a hand pressing. Mara led with small, sure steps. Elias moved with sudden purpose, shoulders squared. They reached the narrow corridor where dust fell in thin showers from the vaulted ceiling. The archivist leaned against cool stone and opened his hand. Inside, the shards smelled of mortar and something older, old blood and ink. Elias pressed a sealed tablet into his palm and forced a quiet, sharp breath. "This proves it," he said. "Look." He broke the seal with a shaky thumb and showed a sequence of numbers and a set of small punched holes that matched the disk's inner ring. The holes formed a counter. The tablet's lead ink was stamped with the High Keeper's private sigil. The archivist's hand tightened around the fragment. The doubt that had surfaced on the hilltop reformed into a growing, cold certainty. Someone had been manufacturing dates to produce deaths. They planned quickly. "If I present this to the council, Mara, they will call for blood. For you, for Elias. We cannot trust the chamber." Elias swallowed. "The keeper will call me traitor if he sees this." He looked at the archivist. "What do you want me to do?" The question carried weight. The archivist's suspicion now sat alongside a cautious, tactical anger. He answered in a clipped voice, "We show a portion and then we mislead. We preserve proof, but we do not hand it to the keeper whole. We create a ledger that points elsewhere." He outlined a plan in short sentences. "Falsify a record, seed a false trail, protect the tablet." Back in the council chamber, the air held wax and a metallic tang. The High Keeper stood beneath the carved fresco and waited with slow certainty. His robe hung heavy. He watched the archivist enter and did not move to restrain him. "You bring trouble in your hands, the High Keeper. You know what trouble demands." The archivist kept his palms visible. He felt his voice narrow into the measured cadence he had used in the archives. "I bring evidence," he answered. A marked sequence that would send villages to death on a false date. The keeper's face did not change. Ink-stained fingertips flexed against his stole. The High Keeper stepped forward and counted on his fingers. He explained cycles in the sort of voice that made a room obey. "We follow a grand pattern," he said. "The disk records cycles of decay and renewal." He tilted his head. "You would deny a law the people accept." The archivist felt anger rise. He kept it small and precise. "This is not the law," he said. "This is a mechanism to make the law appear." The room shifted. Acolytes exchanged looks. Mara's jaw clenched. Elias's face drained. The keeper's response was protocol, and performance rolled into threat. "Return the fragment," he said, and his tone made the command a ritual of its own. Return the fragment and accept judgment. The archivist did not step back. He saw the council's eyes on Mara and Elias. He understood that the public question would fracture loyalties and likely justify a purge. Elias moved then, quickly and with a new stubbornness. He stepped between the keeper and the archivist and pushed a sealed tablet into the High Keeper's chest. "I give it now." Elias allowed. "I did not steal it to sell. I have kept it because I could not follow orders." The keeper's hand hovered over the seal. The room tidied itself into the performance of judgment. Elias's action produced an immediate twist. Instead of an immediate arrest, the keeper opened the seal with theatrical slowness. The tablet inside contained the punched ledger and a short note in a hand the archivist did not expect. The keeper's shorthand mixed with a different hand's looping script. The room watched as the keeper read, and then as color left his face. He barked an order that made acolytes move like clockwork. "Bring the corridor tablet," he said. "Bring the disk." The keeper pivoted to a different form of authority. He would control the narrative by controlling the physical evidence. That pivot broke the council into arguing factions. Voices rose. The archivist heard hands slap benches. One acolyte shouted, "This is a forgery." Another shouted, "The keeper commands order." Mara kept a hand on the archivist's sleeve, pressing a small, deliberate pressure. The archivist felt the emotion shift again, from anger into a brittle clarity. He needed to seize the record without letting the keeper frame it. He moved toward the dais while Mara and Elias created noise, whispering excuses. He passed the keeper's beaded prayer cord and saw the ink on the keeper's fingertips. A guard blocked his path. The archivist pushed past him with a concentrated shove that knocked the man off balance. The chamber erupted. The keeper's low voice cut through the din. "Seize him." The keeper. Two enforcers stepped forward. The archivist did not run. He turned and called out, "Look at the ledger! Read the tablet!" He lifted the fragment he had kept. The chamber's air was tight with the scrape of movement and the scrape of chairs. That moment became the small cliffhanger of the chapter. For 10 seconds the room held, waiting to see whether the keeper's authority would hold or whether the tablet's proof and Elias's confession would shatter the council's unity. Acolytes hesitated, then some moved toward the archivist. Others conferred with the keeper in quick, sharp whispers. The dynamics changed. The keeper's beard twitched with a muscle of calculation. Elias then performed a decisive choice that altered the arc. He stood on a bench and recited a passage from the ritual chronicle that only initiates knew by heart, phrasing the lines to expose the keeper's manipulations. Listen to the syllables he taught Elias, count the holes he ordered. His voice was thin, but it carried. He read the sequence of punched holes aloud, matching the tablet's numbers to the discs in a ring. The assembled acolytes could see the pattern for themselves. For a moment allegiance split. Some acolytes moved to the keeper, some to the archivist. The keeper's response became personal. Elias, he said slow and low, you betray your order. He reached for the ceremonial dagger at his sash. The dagger glinted. The archivist's reaction was instinct. He lofted his coat and placed his body between Elias and the keeper. The keeper's hand curled around the dagger's hilt. Violence erupted. The keeper slashed a sleeve to show resolve and then lunged. Not at Elias but at the exposed mechanisms behind the dais where the disc's counterparts were kept in a service slot. He smashed a brass plate and shouted an order that turned those who followed him into a swarm. Mara struck the keeper's wrist with a ledger. Elias ducked and pushed a bench between them. The chamber filled with the sounds of bodies crashing and wood snapping. Atop the hill the real climax approached. The keeper threw open the service hatch and forced the internal counter to free itself. The disc shuddered in its housing. The keeper's voice rose into a ritual chant that the archivist recognized from the recordings, a pattern intended to bind obedience. The mechanism produced a sudden grinding clunk, and then a small, baked bell sounded, the prearranged signal. The keeper's plan to maintain authority at any cost had included a failsafe that would mark a signal to the outer watchers. When the device sounded, it sent 2 consequences at once. Several acolytes collapsed where they stood as if struck. Some broke into chaotic flight. Outside, a distant horn answered the bell and the hilltop's torchlight flared into a new, harsher brightness. The keeper had chosen to keep the mechanism running rather than to trust argument. The violence cost lives. An enforcer lay with a snapped neck, an acolyte with a bloodied temple. The archivist felt guilt as cold realization cut through him. Stopping the date had been possible, but it had produced immediate carnage. After the crash, the chamber slowed into the dull, regulated work of triage and argument. The archivist seized the moment. He moved to a table and tore a page from a ledger, then wrote a false sequence in a cramped, credible hand. He wrapped the preserved tablet in oilcloth and placed it inside his satchel. He wrote the false ledger and left it conspicuously for the keeper's clerks. Mara took 2 surviving shards and hid them beneath her cloak. Elias sank into a bench with his head in his hands. Outside, they climbed to the hilltop again as dawn leaned on the horizon. The disc lay broken in the field. Stone shards glinted like dull teeth. The archivist set the satchel down and counted. The sealed tablet, the shard from the margin, the falsified ledger, and a strip of ribbon with the keeper's sigil. He felt the last emotion shift of the chapter, from brittle clarity into a sorrowful practicality. He had succeeded in stopping one marked date, but the keeper's network of control still existed. The choice to preserve rather than to expose everything felt like a trade, off that would sit in his chest. He knelt and collected shards, placing them carefully into the satchel. Mara moved with steady hands, and Elias helped, silent. The hill smelled of crushed grass and spent wax. In the field a single circled date half erased, still bled faint red into the soil. The archivist bent lower and pressed his gloved palm to the earth where ink had soaked in. He thought of the brittle leaf from before, its column of names, and how the first name had been crossed out. He thought of the disc's hollow thunk when they levered it out. Those earlier discoveries had led here. He folded the falsified ledger to hide the truth and sealed the satchel with slow, deliberate motions. They returned to a ruined scriptorium for refuge. The archivist set the satchel on the table and ran his fingers along the leather binding of his field journal. He arranged a falsified ledger near the window to catch any cursory eyes. We mislead them, he told Mara and Elias. We will not let a single hand burn the whole of our proof raw to the world. They would use it as excuse, Mara nodded. Elias did not look up. The final decision weighed on the archivist like a cold stone. He could have carried the tablet into the market and screamed the evidence, but the keeper's reach would have turned that impulse into more deaths. He chose instead to protect fragments that could be used later to dismantle the keeper's system piece by piece. He hid the lead tablet in a false spine and wrote a ledger that directed attention to a fabricated sect in a distant province. It was deception, but it bought lives. He arranged the deception with the same care he had used to catalogue manuscripts. Clear headings, plausible hand, scorched edges, convincing marginalia. At dawn he returned to the field alone. The broken disc lay scattered. The outer rings had been pried free. A crow hopped among the stones and picked a cloth, wrapped edge. He knelt and picked up the largest shard. Its face had a faint burn where the keeper's brass plate had struck it. He slid the shard into his satchel. He could feel the town below stirring, church bells beginning to call a different sound. He considered turning the shard over and seeding an accusation, but he closed his fist instead and slid the satchel shut. He placed the falsified ledger beneath a loose flagstone at the scriptorium entrance and pressed it into place. He stood, shoulders tight. Elias and Mara watched from the doorway. You could still be found out. Elias, people will die if they do. Elias's voice broke once, then steadied. The archivist looked at both of them. We saved as many as we could tonight, he said. We traded full exposure for a chance to dismantle. We will use proof slowly. He spoke in short sentences, the way one gives a precise order. Mara stepped forward and laid a hand on the satchel. Then we move fast, she said. We plant seeds where the keeper cannot see them. We teach the patterns to those who will not obey him, the archivist nodded. He knew the work ahead. Slow, careful, requiring him to become a hidden instrument rather than a public herald. He accepted the trade-off. They left before the sun rose fully. The field smelled of crushed earth and faint blood. At the ruined disc the circled date still leaked faint red into soil. The archivist walked past it and felt a tightness in his jaw. He thought of Elias's choice on the bench and the way Mara had ripped the shard from the disc. He packed the satchel, checked the sealed tablet, and then locked it inside his coat. He heard a bell begin to toll from the village below. He closed the satchel on the preserved fragments and walked toward the shattered disc. A single circled date still seeped red into the soil. He bent, picked up a small shard, and then stood and walked away toward the scriptorium, the satchel heavy against his ribs and the sound of the bell growing louder behind him.